Hi, everybody. My name is Jen, and we are going to do some talking about development of the sensory systems today. If you had a chance to watch Jenna's talk on attachment prior, this will be a nice next step. When we're looking at sensory processing, we're looking at how it develops because of the parent-child relationship and within the parent-child relationship. And so what we find is that they go together really, really well, and they're actually pretty hard to separate. So we're going to start by just defining what sensory processing or sensory integration is. Sensory integration is the ability of the central nervous system to organize and process input from different sensory channels in order to make an adaptive response. This term was coined by Jean Ayres back in the 70s. And since then has had a fair amount of research on people looking into how this develops. When we're looking at sensory processing, really what we're looking at is our bodies are always taking in sensory information from our environment. We pull it in from all different systems, which we'll talk about. And then we have some, in our brains, we perceive what we think it is. We perceive if it's safe or not. It helps us understand how we're relating to the world. And then the important thing is what we do back. It's our adaptive response. So for example, if something touched my leg right now, I would know, and I would probably swat it off my leg. So we're doing this all day long. Most of this happens subconsciously for us. But as children develop, they need to learn this skill. So when we're thinking about sensory processing and when we're thinking about attachment, if you watched the video prior, children are born, or babies are born, with actually pretty rudimentary sensory systems. As humans, our experience in utero gives us a lot of calming and organizing sensory input. And then when we come out into the world, we need a lot of external help in order to organize our world. And that's where this interplay between sensory processing and attachment is so vital and is really difficult to pull apart. Some examples of this is when babies are born, their vision is only working to about 10 inches, just the right amount for you to be able to see your mom or dad's face when they're in your arms. Babies are not able to independently do a ton of movement. They don't have a lot of independent movement at this point. So their ability to get input through their vestibular and proprioceptive systems, which we will also go over, is heavily reliant on that parent-child relationship and that ability for a parent to attune to a child's sensory system. The other thing that's important to know about sensory processing skills at birth is our touch system, or our tactile system, is probably our easiest mode of engagement. It makes the most sense to the baby. And so all that early touch that babies get is vital to developing a stronger sensory processing system. So let's talk about the sensory systems. There are 7. What do they do? What we want to see as children grow and as we move into adults is that our sensory processing systems are able to integrate together to give us a clear picture of the world and a clear picture of ourselves. This happens through our early caregiver supports. Our caregivers are there to help us modulate the input coming in. Right? So if a baby is overwhelmed because there's too much noise, the caregiver is going to pull the baby away and help them feel comfortable. If a baby is uncomfortable because they're hungry or their diaper is wet, which is a sensory input, the caregiver is going to support that. So through these repeated supports that the caregiver gives, the baby or the child learns how to modulate these inputs themselves. The other thing that helps to integrate the sensory systems is consistency. The more consistent cues that a child gets each time a sensory input happens, it helps their brain understand some predictability around what to do with the sensory input. The other thing that's really important is balancing exploration versus safety seeking. We all know that children need to learn and explore. They need the opportunity to try things out from a sensory perspective. They also need to know that if they get in over their heads, that their relationship or their parent-child relationship is going to support them to keep them safe. And then the last thing that we can't forget about, we need to always keep in mind, is that we each have our own individual neurological set points that combine with our early experiences. We're each born with our set points of how our brains process sensory information. Some of us need a lot more information in order to make sense of things, and some of us are much more sensitive and need to kind of pull back from extra information. So why do we care? Why do we care about adequate sensory integration or sensory processing? The first reason is adequate sensory processing gives you your awareness of you. It gives you awareness of yourself. Your body supports that. The other thing it does is it gives you awareness of others. So it helps you know that I am me and you are you, and we are separate, right? This develops in early childhood, up through about the age of 2, where you separate from your parent. Our sensory processing skills give us our higher level cognitive skills, right? So we need to know who we are in space. We need to understand our input coming in order to develop those higher level skills like problem solving, flexible thinking, attention, some of those executive function skills that we develop into our later childhood years. Our sensory processing gives us our ability to regulate our arousal states. It helps us regulate our emotions and our behavior. Those sensory inputs, they tie together beautifully with our emotions and our behavior in order to regulate. And it gives us our physical and emotional safety. Our first job in the world is safety seeking. Again, if you watched Jenna's talk before this, our job is safety seeking in this world. That's our first job. If your sensory systems aren't helping you feel safe, that's going to be what you spend primarily most of your time working on, both emotionally and physically. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share just a quick visual with you guys about sensory integration. I like to use this visual. This is work by Dr. Lucy Jane Miller at the SPD Foundation. What it shares for us is that our relationships at the bottom support the development of our sensory systems, right? These are the 8 sensory systems that we'll be going over next. On top of that, if you look at things like attention, gross motor, fine motor, memory, emotional control, all of those build off of our sensory systems, which are supported by our relationships. And so if you look at a child and a child's development, if a child isn't processing well, or their parent-child relationship isn't able, for whatever reason, to support learning how to process sensory information, all of these other things have a difficult time coming online. And that's where we start to see function and growth break down for some kids. So now let's go into the sensory systems. So there's 5 sensory systems that are talked about in school that we know about. I talk about them a little bit differently when we're thinking about development and sensory processing disorders, or when it goes wrong, when it isn't working well for a child or an adult. So our sense of vision, our sense of touch, our sense of taste, smell, and hearing, right, are the 5 that we know about. Then we'll go into the other 3 afterwards. So let's just talk about vision for a second. I referenced vision is pretty closed in when children are born, right? They're only seeing about 10 inches in front of them. Our visual system develops and gives us our sense of what's out there away from us in our world, right? So our vision is able to help us see what's coming. It's our earliest way of orienting and alerting for safety, right? So if you're in an unknown environment and you see something coming in from your periphery, it's going to help you orient to keep you safe. It is a system where sometimes if everything isn't working really well for you, kids and adults can become really hypervigilant to their visual system. So this is where kids will become distressed if their environment changes, if you moved something in their environment. When it's not working well, kids might really, really have a hard time finding an object in a given setting like their room, right? This is where kids are struggling to find the pencil in their backpack because they can't visually discriminate between all of the things. Sometimes we see this playing in when it's not working well, where kids will try to hyper organize their visual environment. They might line things up. They might try to clear spaces. They might actively disorganize their environment by dumping all of the toys out. These are cues that your visual system might not be working really well. When we're looking at vision, obviously we're looking at, acuity and whether a child can see clearly or not. But from a sensory processing perspective, we're really looking at how you're using your vision to organize your environment. The next one of the better known sensory systems is our auditory system, right? So this is our sense of hearing. Obviously, again, we're interested in making sure that a child can hear well. But when we're looking at it from a sensory processing perspective, we're looking at auditory discrimination. So how you're able to hear one sound and maybe block out another. And we're also looking at auditory orienting. So when we're looking at discrimination, what we think about for our auditory system is, are you able to attend to the auditory input that you need to be and not be distracted by all the background noise? We live in a very, very noisy world right now. There's videos going on phones, there's TVs, there's sounds going on everywhere. A lot of the times for our kids, we're giving verbal directions and they might not be able to understand which sound they're supposed to be attending to. Something to really think about is how much noise is happening in the auditory background. You think about a home where there might be a TV on in the background, there might be another conversation, and you're trying to give a verbal direction, and they might not really be hearing you, or there might be a delay in what they're able to hear. We think about a classroom where there's often a lot of sounds and a lot of noise going on, and can a child block out what they need to in order to be able to learn? We're also thinking about things like auditory orienting. So our sense of our auditory system is the only sensory system that gives us 360-degree information, right? So we can hear all the way around us. So if a sound happens behind me, if my system is working well, I'm able to turn, look, understand what it is, and move on in my world. If your auditory system isn't working well for you and you hear a sound, you might not know where it's coming from, which then creates a difficult, a feeling of not being safe. And so this can cause children to be constantly hypervigilant to their environment. We see this with sounds that happen outside, fire trucks, right? And if a child isn't able to understand, oh, that sound is outside and it's over there, they may need to stop everything they're doing, orient, and figure it out before they can feel safe and move on in their world. If the sound of a raised voice has come with a reaction of something bad is going to happen, every time they hear something loud, they're going to go into a place of, I might not be safe, I need to protect. So our auditory system gives us a lot of information about safety in our environment. And really, we need to be able to orient to those things in order to have an auditory system that's working well for us. The next two systems that we know pretty well are gustatory and olfactory. Gustatory is our sense of taste, and olfactory is our sense of smell. When we're looking at sensory processing treatment, we don't use these quite as much, but they're important to reference because they can give us some information about how a child is working within their systems. Our sense of taste, right, helps us determine spicy, sour, sweet, bitter, tart. Sometimes we notice that kids or us as adults seek a certain one of those kind of taste receptors. Something to be aware of is that spicy, sour, right, is pretty alerting to our system. And so sometimes it can help draw out attention. And so sometimes kids will seek that. We'll have kids who seek spicy or sour. They might eat lemons in order to do their homework. They might put hot sauce on their food in order to understand it in their mouth so that they can eat it. So it's just something we notice with our kids and again with ourselves. Our olfactory system, or our sense of smell, is actually really interesting. It's our sensory system that has the closest neurological connections to memory. So when you smell something, it bypasses a whole bunch of other places in our brain and goes straight to our memory centers. So what that means is that the sense of smell can very quickly pull up old memories for us. Again, it's just something we want to be aware of, and it's actually kind of neat. We all have the memories of, walking into a house, of a grandparent's house, or, somebody we loved, and having the smell of, apple pie, or bread baking, and it immediately brings back an emotional connection. We can think about those emotional connections when we're looking at, that smell brings up when we're looking at attachment and relationship. And in treatment, we actually use that quite a bit. And the last pretty well-known system that we have is our tactile system, or our sense of touch. The thing to really think about our tactile system is it gives us our container of our body, right? It's the edges of our body. It tells us where we end and where space begins. So when our tactile system is working well, we understand that. It keeps us safe because we know that this is where we end. If your tactile system isn't working well for you, you're not going to have that sense of security around where your edges are, which sometimes is going to make children feel pretty unsafe periodically in their world. There's a couple of different kinds of receptors in our skin. I'm not going to get into them all, but you can break them into two. One is our protective sense. So this is our receptors in our skin that let us know if something is safe or not safe, right? We need this. This is important in our world. This is what keeps us from touching the hot stove or pulling our hand back quickly if we touch a hot stove. It's unsafe. I need to move my hand. This is what gets us to react when we step on something sharp, right? We need to pick our foot up. So we should be using our protective sense to keep us safe. The other system that develops is in our tactile system, our touch system, is our discriminative sense. So this one's really cool because it gives us the what. It gives us the context about touch. It tells us, is it wet? Is it dry? Is it slimy? Is it bumpy? In infancy, there's the developmental phase where children are going through, where they are learning all about discriminative sense of touch, right? This is the phase where they're into everything, they're mouthing everything, and they're touching everything. They're touching your face. They're figuring all that out. This is the developmental stage that should happen and needs to happen in order to have a well-functioning touch system. If this system doesn't turn on, either because of neurological reasons, because our tactile system is already kind of hypersensitive, or because a child doesn't have experiences to be able to go through that phase of just discriminative sense, or because touch relationally was found to be unsafe. Everybody is going to rely on their protective sense. What this means is that if a touch comes into their system that is inherently safe, so for example, I put my arm around you to comfort you, that will be tagged as something to protect from. And the child might have a big emotional reaction because of it. Another example is if our touch system is always on high alert and we put a different texture shirt on our skin, that might be tagged as something unsafe. So when your touch system is working well, your body says, I don't need to pay attention to the feeling of these clothes on my body. It's not important anymore. It's safe. I'm moving on. If your tactile system is hypersensitive and hasn't had the opportunity to work through the discriminative sense, it's going to keep flagging it as something to worry about. So what we see functionally is we see kids who, when they're in lines with other kids, when somebody comes near them and they might touch them, they react really big. They might hit the kid in front of them. We see, we're getting dressed, putting new clothes on or different clothes on is really, really hard for kids. We see some of the daily cares like hair washing, teeth brushing, fingernail clipping is expressed as painful by the kids because their touch system is so extreme. We see when it's not working well, especially when there's early relational or early trauma histories, which we're going to get into in another video here, that carrying touch even though, can be tagged as something that is not safe. So touch is a huge overlap with our attachment systems and with the development of relationships. And in treatment, we spend a lot of time working on the touch systems. All right, so now we're going to go into the lesser known sensory systems. These are the ones that we don't learn about in school, but they are vitally important to helping kids develop into being able to function in their world with independence. So the first system of these three is our proprioceptive system. Our proprioceptive system lives in our joints and our muscles, and it gives us information about our body position, which, right, most of us don't think about. Most of us don't think about how we're sitting. Are our legs crossed or not crossed? If I'm asked to sit crisscross applesauce, my body knows how to do that. I know when my legs are folded because that's my proprioceptive system giving me information. If I'm asked to, to jump down from something, I know how far I need to bend my legs to jump. That just inherently is working because my proprioceptive system developed from my infancy and is working for me now. So it gives us our sense of body position. It also gives us a sense of our speed and the force that we need in order to make something happen in the world. So for example, if I were to lift up my computer, I know how much force I need to use on my computer because I've done it a million times. My muscle memory remembers that and knows that for me. If I'm going to come in and shake your hand, I know how much force I need to use. So that's when your system is working well, that kind of all happens for you automatically. This develops in infancy when kids are banging, right? They bang on things. They push on things, right? They're pushing everything. That's them developing their proprioceptive system. They're climbing up on things. They're seeing how high they can go and what they need to do. That's proprioceptive in nature. They're pulling, right? They're pulling on things. That's all proprioceptive in nature. When our proprioceptive system isn't working well for us, it's typically we see it in that it's not giving us enough information. So we might be sitting in a chair, but we might not be doing it really effectively because we don't know that we need to get our feet pushing on the ground more. We might be asked to sit at circle time, but we're not able to stay upright because our proprioceptive system isn't giving us enough information. So oftentimes we see kids banging, slithering around on the floor, poking their friend, all of these things because their system isn't able to just be still and pay attention to what they're supposed to, right? When kids are struggling with proprioceptive input, it can look kind of naughty because oftentimes they're rougher than you would expect. Sometimes kids are harder with their friends than you would expect. They might come up to give you a hug and literally knock you over because it's with so much force, because their bodies need a ton of force to even feel it. So our proprioceptive system is inherently our core. It really helps us understand that we are in the world. It helps us effectively move through our world with some sort of flow. The other thing to think about with proprioception is we also get proprioception through our jaw and our mouth. So that's a cue that we get from a lot of our kids. So sucking, chewing, blowing on things is all proprioceptive in nature. So when you see kids biting or chewing on things really intensely, chewing on shirts, chewing on zippers of coats, chewing on their, toys, that's a cue that they're needing more proprioceptive input into their world, right? Developmentally, that's very, very appropriate up through, 12, 18 months where, we're giving kids chewies and we're letting them use their mouths. For some of our kids who are older than that, they're still in that developmental phase of exploring with proprioception. And at that age, it becomes but socially appropriate. And so what we look at is how can we still provide the input that kids need in a socially appropriate and safe way. As an overcap, proprioceptive inputs are pushing, pulling, lifting, carrying, and bearing any weight on those joints. And so if you observe your child, you can often see them seeking, if they're needing this kind of input, you can see through their actions pretty clearly that they're kind of trying to get this. Again, when kids seek things, they don't necessarily understand the why behind it. And so sometimes they're doing it in a way that might either not be as effective or might not be as appropriate for the context. And so our job as adults would be to support them in ways that's safe and appropriate, which we'll get into in further conversations. Our vestibular system. So our vestibular system is an interesting one. It's really hard to separate out from all the other systems. It inherently ties together with our vision and with our hearing. But for sake of teaching, I'm going to separate it out for you guys. Our vestibular system is housed in our inner ears. It's the thing that makes us dizzy. It gives us our head position. It tells us the speed you're moving. What's interesting about our vestibular system is it gives you your understanding to gravity. So our vestibular system is so inherent into us that it helps us know that we're up. It helps us know that we're connected to the earth. If anybody's ever had vertigo, right, which is inherently a disorder of the vestibular system, how disorienting that can be. You don't know, you kind of lose your sense of self a little bit. Our vestibular system, when infants are born, right, they're at sort of the mercy of how our adults move us in this world, right? When our head tips back in space for a diaper change, that's vestibular in nature. The swaying we do with infants, the infant swings and the swaying in arms, that's vestibular in nature. Children need vestibular input in order to organize movement, muscle tone, vision. It needs to be also provided in a consistent and rhythmic and predictable way. So our vestibular system is what helps us develop our motor skills, right? When babies push up on their tummies and lift their head, that's our vestibular system kicking in along with our proprioceptive system of pushing. Without our vestibular system, we get lost in space. And so what we see when it's not working well is kids keep their heads upright. They don't want to move their heads. So they get very protective. They don't want to bend over to put their shoes on. Hair washing, where you typically have to tip your head back, is terrifying. They may not want to be off the ground. Climbing on playground equipment may be really, really, really scary for them because they don't know how far they are off the ground. The other things that vestibular system can do is if you're needing more vestibular input to understand your body, kids, you'll see them, they're just kind of like flipping all the time. They might spend a lot of time upside down. They may move real quickly through the environment because they need a lot of input. They might try to spin themselves, right, to give themselves input. So those are cues that our vestibular system isn't working well. They might spend hours and hours on swings, trying to get the input that they need. They might really struggle sitting still. They might always need to be moving or shaking rocking in order to attend in the world. And then the last one that we like to think about is our sense of interoception. And so this is one that's more recently being talked about, but it's vital. So our sense of interoception is the sense we receive from our internal organs, right? It's our inside sensory processing system. It's our sense of feeling of fullness or hunger. It's our bladder control. Our interoception is very closely related or linked to our tactile system. You can kind of think of it as the tactile system on the inside. It's also connected to our gut sense, our emotional gut sense, right? So when something isn't right, you feel a tightening sometimes in your stomach, and that's truly a neurological cue that something's not right. So what we see when there's been a lot of medical procedures, what we see when there's GI concerns in kids, what we see when there's been a fair amount of trauma, is that one of the first things that humans do is they shut that sense off. They stop paying attention to it. What happens is then we lose the ability to monitor our feelings of fullness and hunger. Bowel bladder control becomes a concern. That idea of paying attention to our gut sense, our emotional gut sense, goes away. So as we organize the systems, as we help turn that back on for kids, then we can get some of that hunger satiation. But what we notice is that kids might be ravishingly hungry and disorganized, but not be able to understand that they need to eat some food. So we see this often in clients we see where parents have to sort of monitor from the outside some of those things until we're able to turn it back on for kids. So how do our sensory systems sort of connect into our relationships, right? So as I've sort of alluded to, when babies are born, they need a lot of help to start understanding their sensory systems. Our sensory systems create perception. So we understand through experience after experience after experience what's probably going to happen when an input happens. So for example, when I see an orange sitting on the counter, I immediately have a visual representation of what it's going to taste like. Right? I know what it's going to taste like. I know what it's going to feel like. Right? That's my state memory. That's my sensory perception that's given me that over the years. It's easy. I know I don't have to pay attention because my system is working pretty well. My experiences have taught me that. In infancy and childhood, our relationships help develop our perception, right? And so if every time, an example that we see periodically is that, when babies first start to eat, their faces are just kind of a disaster. They're messy, right? We get all that tactile input. If every time a baby's face is messy, a parent reacts with, "Whoa, your face is messy. There's a lot of food on your face." The relationship and the sensory input is tying together to say, "Oh yeah, I know what happens when there's food on my face. I need to probably wipe it off." If the relational experience is such that the parent, probably because of their own sensory system, doesn't feel comfortable with the food on the face and immediately gets it off as if it maybe shouldn't belong there, the input that goes into the baby is, when I feel food on my face, something's wrong, right? And so that alerts the baby. So what happens is the relational input and the sensory input work together to give you your understanding of your sensory systems. So our sensation and perception does again two things for us. It lets us know if we're safe, right? So there's the classic example of, for many of us in this world, seeing a snake is a little alerting to us. We've all had the experience of walking in a yard and seeing a garden hose and immediately going to that's a snake and I might be unsafe. That's just a classic example of our sensory perception quickly jumping in to keep us safe. This should happen, but what we want is a sensory system that is working well enough and an understanding of our sensory input that's working well enough that we don't get triggered and go into a fight-flight state each and every time a sensory input happens. The other thing that our sensation and perception helps us is helps us discriminate. It helps us just understand what you need to pay attention to in the world and what's just not that important. We can't pay attention to all the inputs that are coming in. Then there would be no sustained attention, the ability which we need in order to learn. And we'll go into that a little bit more in a regulation talk. but it gives us our ability to discriminate. Oh, I know what this is, moving on. Or like, I see this, okay, I see some stairs, I know about how much force I'm going to need to exert to make this happen. When this is working well for us, we're able to move on and just be able to learn from our environment. We shouldn't be ruled by these inputs coming in all the time. For some of our kids with sensory processing disorders, they spend all of their days attending to the input and organizing that, which then takes them away from the ability to do the things that they need to be doing, which is learning and socializing and engaging. So I wanted to send you guys with one little exercise at the end of this section of the presentation. We do this with our families in clinic very, very frequently. So we spend a lot of time talking about sensory processing for our kids, but it also happens for all of us. Our sensory processing skills happen for all of us as adults. This happens for everybody. Sensory processing is something that happens in humans. So in order to really organize your child's sensory system, you really have to have an awareness of your own. So something I like to have families do or parents do is take just draw an outline of a little human for yourself. Draw a little head, just as a child would, and then take an interaction that you've had in the past and just pay attention to what it did for your system. Pay attention to how you felt. Did you feel tightness in your stomach? Did your arms feel tight and burning? Was there tension in your eyes? What we find is that if parents can have an awareness of what works for their systems, it really, really helps them engage around their child's sensory systems.